well either, so it wouldn't be very good in the water. It turns out they haven't said that for about 15 years. And the reason they haven't said that is when paleontologists began to dig up fossils that looked exactly like the organism that they said couldn't possibly have existed, they hadn't anything to say. And the organism you see here, which plugs right into the middle of this, it's an almost perfect intermediate form, has the wonderful Latin name of Ambulocetus natans. And those of you who have taken Latin, you know exactly what I just said. Ambulocetus is the walking whale, and natans is who swims. This was an intermediate form and a perfect one. But here's the cool part. Once it was discovered where this guy was found, in the Indus River Valley between India and Pakistan, other paleontologists showed up for a look as well. And guess what? They found a second species, also intermediate in this area. Then a third. And as it turns out, a total of 6 intermediate forms are now understood between these land mammals and their cetacean descendants. Now, I actually swiped this image from a wonderful book by Carl Zimmer, a science writer. And I was very careful when I gave a talk in New Haven, Connecticut last year to attribute it to Carl, because he lives near New Haven and I thought he might show up. And he'd be steamed if I didn't mention that it came from his book. And sure enough, he was there. And he caught me afterwards and said, "I'm glad you gave me credit for that." I said, "You're welcome, Carl." But then he said, "But I have to tell you there's a mistake in the diagram." And I was kind of bummed out. I said, "Oh man, what did I do now?" He said, "You said there were 6 in here." That's out of date. There turned out to be 21. That is how dramatically the fossil record of cetacean evolution has expanded. In fact, Hans Twissen, who discovered some of these key fossils, he's a paleontologist from Ohio, actually wrote an article called "Whale Origins as the Poster Children for Macroevolution." And indeed they are. We understand this very well. Now there's a former student from Brown who's now a professor in the area at Swarthmore College. His name is Colin Parrington. And even more so than me, Colin is a real wise guy. And after my testimony in the Dover trial, Colin actually called me up and said, "Ken, I read your testimony. It's good, but it's much too verbose. You shouldn't have spent a day and a half on the stand. You should have ended it all with 1 sentence. And I said, "Colin, 1 sentence?" He says, "Yeah, it's 1 sentence. And it's so simple I can put it on a bumper sticker and I'll mail it to you." 2 days later, I open the mail. Here's the bumper sticker. "We have the fossils. We win." End of story. All 3 of these yolk protein genes that are found in birds. They're called VIT1, VIT2, VIT3. How do we understand why they're there? There's only one way to explain them, and that is our evolutionary ancestry. But it gets even better than that. Because as it turns out, VIT1 and VIT3 were lost first in the entire line leading to mammals. VIT2 hung on later, and as it turns out, VIT2 is the one yolk protein gene that works in monotremes, egg-laying mammals like the platypus. There are 2 non-functional remnants right there. And here's the other cool part. Based on DNA sequence changes, the loss of the yolk protein genes paralleled the appearance of the milk protein genes and the evolution of the placenta. In short, it's a developmental story that fits the molecular story brilliantly. There's an even clearer example of our ancestry to be found in human chromosome numbers. We humans have 46 chromosomes. All the other primates, all the other great apes without exception, have 48. Why, if we share a common ancestor with these guys, that common ancestor had 48, how can we possibly have 2 fewer? Is it possible, and all the biology students in here know those 46 chromosomes are actually 2 sets of 23. How could we have gone from 24 sets to 23? Could we have just lost a pair of chromosomes? Not possible. The loss of both members of a homologous pair of chromosomes would be fatal. Fatal to you and me, fatal to a chimp, everything. The only possibility is that what must have happened is that 2 chromosomes that are still separate in the other primates must have gotten accidentally stuck together to form a single chromosome in us. That would have dropped us from 24 pairs down to 23. So that's the explanation that is consistent with evolutionary common ancestry. But here's why evolution is science. That's a testable explanation. If that really happened, somewhere in the human genome we contain a recently fused chromosome. And if it's not there, this whole idea of evolution by common ancestry is in trouble. Now how would we find a chromosome like that? Easier than you think. I've sketched 2 chromosomes up here. The tips of every human chromosome has a highly repetitive DNA sequence in it called a telomere. That's in blue. Near the center is an equally special region called the centromere, that's in red. If one of our chromosomes was formed by the fusion of two primate chromosomes, you know what it should look like? It should have telomere DNA in the center, and it should have two centromeres. It should be really easy to pick out. Do we have a chromosome like that? The answer is, you bet we do. It's called chromosome number 2. The chromosome number 2 has every mark that I've just mentioned should be there as evidence of human common ancestry with the other great apes. It's clear, it's straightforward, it's incontrovertible. But scientific evidence is only part of the story. The other part is a kind of religious fear of evolution itself. And this was summarized very nicely by your former senator in Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, in an interview that he gave a couple of years ago. He said, evolution has huge consequences for society. It's where we come from. Does man have a purpose? Is there a purpose to our lives? Or are we just the result of chance? If we're simply a mistake of nature, that puts a different moral demand on us. In fact, it doesn't put a moral demand on us that if, in fact, we are a creation of a being that has moral demands. That's a powerful statement. And I want to focus in on what Santorum said about evolution saying we are a mistake of nature. Is evolution really driven by mistakes? A lot of biologists would say yes, because we think that mutations provide the raw material for evolution, and mutations are mistakes. But my biochemistry prof, when I was an undergrad, said, if you think this is a mistake, imagine an organism that's perfect, that never makes a mistake. If it never makes a mistake, it never has a mutation. Is that a good thing? Well, if you have no mutations, you can have no adaptations to new conditions in the environment. You'll have no evolution. And you know what will happen over a few years? You won't survive. Therefore, maybe this business of making mistakes is wrong. Mistake is the wrong word. Maybe evolution isn't a mistake of nature. Maybe it's an essential element of nature itself. And I think that's exactly the right way to look at evolution. To me, there's a key insight here. And that is the claim that evolution is this chance and random process, meaning anything can happen, for many people is at the heart of objections to what they call Darwinism. But I want to tell you today that evolution isn't random. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's start off this way. We live in a material, by the way, this is one of the few things that Madonna consistently gets right. We live in a material world. The capacity for life is literally built into the physics and chemistry of matter. So evolution is an inherent and predictable property of nature. It's not a mistake. Evolutionary processes are creative. They explore adaptive space, and in doing that, they're driven by natural selection, which is not a random process, and by natural law, which is not random either. Now, I'm going to skip this slide because it requires some explanation, but some leading cell and developmental biologists basically agree with exactly what I've just said. What this means is an evolutionary design to life really is part of the inherent fabric of the natural world. And I would argue, therefore, that the emergence of a living world, very much like the one we live in, isn't some random accident. It's an outcome that is made possible, maybe even inevitable, by the fabric of nature itself. And again, I'm not the only person to feel that way. The paleontologist Simon Conway Morris from Cambridge University has argued exactly the same thing, that human life, or something like it, is inevitable in the universe in which we live, given the constraints of nature. Now, what does all of this mean? I think there are several ways to look at it. And I would say to religious people, the fruitfulness of the evolutionary process can be understood as a reflection of what they might call divine creativity and promise. To non-religious people, there's none of that, and evolution is just a property of nature itself. But either way, the study of that nature is exactly the same. And I would say that ultimately this is why science is compatible with faith. Now, many people might say, yeah, but there are a lot of scientists who say that science is not compatible with faith. Most famously, Richard Dawkins, who's written extensively on evolution, is the author of the best-selling book, The God Delusion. And Dawkins has written that the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And every time I read that, I always wonder, how does Richard manage to get up in the morning? I mean, galaxy. These are all galaxies, and each of them have about 100 million stars in each of them. To me, this doesn't look like a bleak universe. This looks like a universe that is bursting with evolutionary possibilities of the very sort that we have on this planet. So I wonder if one might look at this very same science and say the following, and that is the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect from the wisdom of a provident and purposeful God, intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world, and committed to a promise of freedom that makes genuine love possible. Now, a lot of my scientific colleagues would say, that doesn't sound very scientific, Ken. And I would say, that's right. That's not a scientific statement. But do you know what? Dawkins' statement wasn't scientific either. It was a philosophical statement that he thinks was informed by science, and that's pretty much what mine is as well. And I think that's the essential point here, which is that science can be understood by people of faith in ways exactly like this. Now, I'm not the only flaky scientist to feel that way. Probably the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century, in fact, for sure, was Theodosius Dobzhansky. Dobzhansky very famously wrote, and every biology teacher knows this, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And he was absolutely right. But in the very same article, look at what he wrote. The diversity of life is reasonable and understandable if the Creator made the living world not by caprice, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. It is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive. I, Dobzhansky, the scientist, am a creationist and an evolutionist. Why? Because evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not something that happened 4,000 years ago. It is a process that began 10 billion years ago and is still underway today. He said the contrast between creation and evolution is absurd because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution which appears as a reality that we must see and which enriches our understanding of life and being. Now, I know that's a complex statement, but if you want things boiled down for you, do what I always do. Go to the New York Post. What does the New York Post do? They always summarize things well. God and evolution do mix poke. Now, lastly, does this mean that the Bible should be read as a scientific textbook? The answer is of course not. But I want to let you know that I'm not the first person to say that. St. Augustine, writing at the beginning of the 5th century, said exactly the same thing. Now, you can read this yourself, and I'm going to translate it on the fly into what I think is 21st century English. And look at what he's telling people. Even a non-believer can study geology, astronomy, zoology, botany, and other sciences, and can gain scientific knowledge from observation and experiment. Now, the worst thing that could happen would be for a non-believer to hear a Christian, presumably explaining the Bible, talking nonsense on these scientific topics. We Christians have to do everything we can to prevent the embarrassment of non-believers showing up scientific ignorance in a Christian and ridiculing it. That's Augustine telling you, don't read Scripture as science. He's not worried about Charles Darwin. He's worried about an understanding of Scripture. Are modern scientific ideas like the Big Bang, are they compatible with a faith that's based in Scripture? I often like to challenge students by asking them, who came up with the idea of the Big Bang? Was it this Einstein guy? It turns out it wasn't Einstein. It was the guy you see standing next to him right there. His name was Father Georges Lemaitre. He was trained in mathematics and physics. There's a wonderful biography of him called The Day Without Yesterday. And Father Lemaitre was the person who demonstrated to Einstein that general relativity requires an expanding universe. And ultimately, Father Lemaitre was right. One of the great fundamental discoveries of 20th century physics was in fact made by him. And he was often asked by people, but you're a priest. Doesn't the Big Bang contradict the Bible? Here's what Father Lemaitre said. The writers of the Bible were illuminated more or less on salvation, but on other questions they were just as smart or just as dumb as everybody else in their generation. Hence, it is utterly unimportant if errors of historic and scientific fact are found in the Bible, especially if errors relate to events that were not directly observed by those who wrote about them. And Genesis certainly falls under that idea. He continued, because they were right in the doctrine of immortality and salvation, they also have to be right on all other subjects. Is simply a fallacy of people who have an incomplete understanding of why the Bible was given to us at all. And indeed, I think that's true. I was challenged by a scientific colleague once after I read that Augustine quote. He said, what kind of weird science would we get if we followed the prescriptions of some bizarre mystic like Augustine? And I thought, oh, I know how to answer that question. I want to answer it with the life of a person who was so taken by the thought of St. Augustine that he joined a religious order founded according to Augustinian thoughts. This is a picture of the guy. This is probably the one audience in the world where I can't get away with hoping most of the audience doesn't know who that is. He was considered a deeply religious person. He became the abbot of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn, in what is today the Czech Republic. And at one point in his life, he got interested in what today we would call a scientific question. How did he solve the question? Did he read Scripture? Of course he read Scripture. Did he pray? Of course, he prayed every day. But to answer the scientific question, he went into the garden and he did experiments. As you all know, the name of that Augustinian priest was Father Gregor Mendel, the founder of the modern science of genetics. What kind of science do you get when you follow Augustinian precepts? You get genetics. And I think that is as profound a statement as anyone can make about the ultimate compatibility of science and religion. I thought the person who put it best, ironically, was a very conservative writer for the Washington Post, himself not a Christian, but a person of faith, named Charles Krauthammer. And after the Dover trial, he wrote a column, and you can see the message up here. Phony theory, false conflict. Intelligent design foolishly pits evolution against faith. And Krauthammer wrote, this is why he's a columnist, he knows how to turn a phrase. How ridiculous to make evolution the enemy of God. What could be more elegant, more simple, more brilliant, more economical, more creative, indeed more divine than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct and yet interactive, all ultimately derived from accumulated variations in a single double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas Board of Education. And I think that puts it very well. And finally, I have to tell you that I am often asked by people, what do you think about evolution? Don't you find it depressing to think that you're just an animal or you're descended from ancestors who crawled up out of the slime? And I let that sink in for a minute, and I would say, no, I don't think so. I find it astonishing and remarkable to think that you and I are united, not just with each other, but with every other living thing on this planet, in a fabric of life that has mastered the conditions of this planet and has given rise to everything we see in the living world, ourselves included. That's the way I'd put it. But I think the way that somebody put it 150 years ago was even better. He said, I don't find this depressing or demeaning or demoralizing. He said, on the contrary, I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And ladies and gentlemen, I think those are words to live by. Thank you very much. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to invite this or not, but those of you who have to leave, please leave. But if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Right up here. As loud as you can, and I'll repeat it if we can.
I would like very much to ask you one question that is the greatest amount of this problem. And I thought that perhaps it is the area that most concerns evolutionists from non-evolutionists, and that is, in your mind, which do you think is the most significant gap that you can identify that still produces a problem for you as evolutionists to answer?
Okay, the question was, here's a tough one. Which, in my mind, is the biggest gap that still causes the greatest difficulty for me as an evolutionist to answer. Let me answer it this way. The notion of there being gaps in the fossil record or understanding of the history of life and so forth, this is hardly surprising. All histories have gaps. There are parts of my own family's history that I cannot fill in. There are parts of the history of the American Revolution that we're not sure about. There are elements of the Battle of Gettysburg that took place not very far from here that no one can quite fill in. But the broader question, which is, where did my family come from? Or who won the Battle of Gettysburg? We can answer these questions without knowing everything that happened on those 3 days in July in detail. We can also answer the broad question about evolution in great detail. Did life on this planet appear all at once? No. Did it appear through a progression? Yes. Is that progression consistent with an evolutionary idea of change over time and natural selection? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. Did our species appear all at once? No. Like everything else on this planet, we evolved. So those broad questions we can answer. In terms of the single question that I would most like to have the answer to, it's because I'm a cell biologist, I want to know where the first living cell came from. That, for me, is worth 2 or 3 Nobel Prizes over the years. And I'm very excited. I will be very excited if that's a question we solve. Now, every now and then, I'm asked by someone who is skeptical of evolution, why can't you scientists admit that the first living thing on this planet could have been the result of a miracle? And my answer always is, sure, I can admit that the first living thing on this planet could have been a miracle, or for that matter, the Red Sox in 2004 could have been a miracle, or the Mets in the summer of '69. It's impossible to exclude the miraculous, and if you're a person of faith, I don't think you want to exclude the miraculous. But the answer I always give to fellow Christians is, whatever you do, don't pin your faith on the supposition that you have a question that science will never answer. And the reason for that is science is awfully good at answering the questions that have been thought to be unanswerable. I don't see any inherent barrier in taking the following fact, which we know to be true, which is that life is a phenomenon of physics and chemistry. The ability to be alive comes out of the nature of matter and energy. To me, it seems perfectly reasonable that the ability to evolve life is part of that fertile universe. As Father George Coyne is always fond of saying, we are literally made out of stardust, meaning that we are made of the material of stars, and that material itself is the material, the raw material for life. So for me, that's what I want to find out about, but I don't see that as a barrier to the evolutionary explanation at all. A very good question. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sir.
On the one hand, it's depressing to see how evolution is viewed in the United States as that graphic so illustrated.
For sure.
On the other hand, it's very nice and ennobling to have an articulate and gifted champion like yourself.
Oh, thanks a lot.
The question I have is about some of the things that Dawkins has written. And he challenges us to, as scientists, to view the existence of the deity as a testable hypothesis.
Right. And
I was wondering if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I consider Richard Dawkins a friend. He and I have shared the platform a couple of times. We exchange email from time to time. And if you look up my name in the index of the God Delusion, you'll see he gives me 2 pages, and they're very complimentary pages. He never treated me badly. He is a bit confused by me, by Francis Collins, by George Coyne, by Dobzhansky, and by any other scientist who doesn't immediately, in his view, grasp the obvious, which is that the hypothesis of God is nonsense. I think he, for all of his virtues, he's a great science writer and a great popularizer of science. For all of his virtues as a thinker and a writer, I think he doesn't clearly understand the boundary between science and philosophy. And he's very happy to make philosophical statements, as we all are, but without realizing that he's strayed beyond the bounds of science to make testable statements. And most of his arguments in the God hypothesis are not scientific arguments. They're arguments that saying religious faith is the source of all the bad stuff that happens in the world. And at one point in there, he says something to the effect that if you have no faith, If there's no faith, then there's no crusades, there's no pogroms, there's no Holocaust. We don't have any reason to kill each other anymore, and so forth. And I've actually spoken to Richard about this, and I said, I've never seen you act so naive than to think that if we abolish religious faith, it will solve any of our problems. And to me, it's notable that the great mass killings of the 20th century, the Stalinist purges, the killings of 20 or 30 million during the Cultural Revolution, the Cambodian genocide, all these things that I just mentioned took place in states that had officially abolished religion. Didn't seem to help them. This sort of tendency is part of the sad characteristics of human nature and not something that's unique to religion. So I think, basically, I strongly agree with Richard Dawkins on evolutionary science, and I completely disagree with him on the question of hypothesis of God, on the hypothesis of God question, and also on the value of theism. And I would point out, and that's one of the reasons I showed, for example, both Father Gregor Mendel and Father Georges Lemaitre, that people of faith not only can make profound scientific contributions, but often they are motivated by their religious faith to try to unravel the secrets and the mystery of nature. So therefore, I think he's really naive and very much off base in his judgments about religion. Thanks. Perhaps another question or two? Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you were testifying in the trials, what arguments were the intelligent design people making that say that what they were saying was actually exactly?
Okay, the question is, when I was testifying in the Dover trial, what arguments were the intelligent design people making that would say that therefore intelligent design is a good idea? Well, there was a really interesting dynamic to this trial, and that is, you have to remember that at any lawsuit, this was a lawsuit, not a criminal trial, the plaintiffs go first. Now, the plaintiffs in this case were the 11 parents who objected to the intelligent design policy. So the plaintiffs make their case first, and then the defense, which were the attorneys for the school board, goes second. It's not a debate. So in other words, I wanted to make some arguments against intelligent design, but I couldn't get up there at the same time as the intelligent design witnesses. They were going to follow me. So my job, and I was the lead witness for our side, was first of all, explain the scientific evidence for evolution. I then had to explain what goes into a biology textbook, since it was my own textbook, which is actually used in Dover right up to this point. And then I had to say, here are the arguments that you will hear from the expert witnesses for the intelligent design side. So I had to first tell the judge what the upcoming witnesses were going to tell him, and then I had to explain why all of that was wrong. So in effect, I had to give their testimony first, and then I had to answer it. And if I had done that unfairly, and what I mean by that is if I had said, well, he's going to say A, B, and C, and then 3 weeks later they showed up and they said something quite different, then obviously my testimony would have been ineffective. But I did explain, and a couple other witnesses too, did to exactly what they were going to say, and here's why it was wrong. And what happened was the judge had been treated to the notion that the intelligent design witnesses will say, and they'll base their arguments over and over again on complex biological structures like the bacterial flagellum. Bacterial flagellum is this really cool sort of acid-powered rotary motor. Thing can spin several thousand revolutions per minute. It's a true rotary engine. It's reversible. It's just unbelievably cool. It's made of about 40 different proteins. They're going to say that it had to be created, designed, all at the same time, and here's why. Unless you have all 40 proteins in there, it doesn't work. So it's not like you could evolve 30, then 31, 32, 33, nothing's happening, 38, nothing happening, 39. Then you put in part number 40 and here it comes. Evolution couldn't do that. Only a designer, indeed, could put all of them together. And I explained to the judge, that's going to be the argument. However, for that argument to be true, it would also mean that these little assemblies of 4 proteins, 3 proteins, 10 proteins have absolutely no function. Turns out that in the bacterial flagellum, there's a little group of 10 proteins that in bacteria that don't have flagella functions as a secretory system. There's a group of 3 or 4 proteins that function in another capacity called signal transduction. And in fact, there's a whole series of all of these little proteins have functions of their own. And the big function only emerges when you put them all together. So the notion, the argument that they will make, that all the parts have to be together before you have a useful function that natural selection can favor, that's a testable argument and it's wrong. And I also explained how it was wrong for other systems. Sure enough, they showed up, they tried to make the argument. You do get to cross-examine them. 2 local attorneys from here in Philadelphia, Eric Rothschild and Stephen Harvey, had learned in preparation for the trial so much biology, it just amazes me. I was ready to give these guys at least a master's degree for how much biology they had learned, and they very masterfully took the testimony to this effect from the witnesses of the other side and just took it apart and were able to show to the judge that it simply wasn't true. And there were a lot of things in the trial that were really funny. One of them was something that the other side derisively referred to as a cheap lawyer's trick. Here was the cheap lawyer's trick. One of the witnesses from the other side had claimed that there were no articles in the scientific literature documenting anything about the evolution of the immune system, particularly the part of the system that enables us to make antibodies against all sorts of foreign invaders like the H1N1 flu and everything else. Well, it turns out that in the 10 years since this individual had written a book about this, we actually have, the scientific community, pretty well figured out where this part of the immune system came from. It came from a class of DNA elements called retrotransposons. We know which one it came from. It behaves just like it. And there's just paper after paper. So what happened, got him on the stand, and this very clever attorney said, okay, professor, here's an article. It's called The Darwinian Adaptive Evolution of the Immune System. Doesn't this show that you're wrong, that there are no such articles? And he said, no, I'm going to wave that away. It's not the kind of evidence that I really think is necessary. He says, okay, I got another paper here. Read it, says, nope, not good enough. Another paper. No, I haven't read that one, but I can tell. So he eventually piled up 49 papers in front of the defendant, so they're on the witness stand. Then there's 6 or 7 books that have been written on the evolution of the immune system. And one at a time, he piled the books up in front of him, saying, none of these are good enough to get you to say he says, nope, still not good enough. Then medical school textbooks on immunology. At this point, the pile, there are photographs of this pile. This pile's about this high. And what happens is both the attorney and the witness, I have to say, are relatively short. So what happened was, here's this pile in front of this poor guy. The attorney keeps ducking behind the pile. So the witness is on the stand trying to keep eye contact with him. And the attorney is being as annoying as he possibly could by moving behind the pile. And finally, the witness turns to the judge and says, Your Honor, can I move all this evidence out of the way? And when he does pick it up, this part's in the transcript, he lifts it up and says, it's awfully heavy. Again, the wrong thing to say when you're about to dismiss all this evidence. Now, as I told you, the attorneys for the other side said that was just a cheap lawyer's trick. Eric Rothschild, who was the attorney, said, thank you. That, to me, is the mark of somebody who is not only literally, but figuratively a Philadelphia lawyer. Okay, in one sense or another. I want to thank you all very much for coming. It's been a great honor, and I appreciate it. Thank you for correcting me. That's the kind of correction. That's the kind of correction, just like the whale correction, which is it's not 6, it's 22 or something like that. I'll keep that in mind. Thanks. Okay, terrific. Let me pick up my toys and come down. So, yeah.